And over dinner, he was ladling it on that I could have power and prestige and privilege and money. And I was actually quite happy doing what I was doing. So I wasn't all that moved by this. But then his wife, asked me if I'd like to help her do the dishes. And when she had me completely cornered, she said, forget everything your senior partner has just told you. This is about family. This is about duty. This is about honor. You've got to do the job. And she kind of hooked me that way. And so I thought, well, let's give it a go at least. There's no harm in trying a new job. And a long-term relationship is much more fulfilling and much more efficient, actually, than just doing transactions. And strategically, it's not intuitive until you think about it, that a small bank cannot possibly compete with a big bank on balance sheet, on global scale, on execution of transaction things. But a big bank can't possibly compete with a small bank on depth of relationships with its chosen customers. So on technology, we are actually followers. We do most of what everybody else does. But then occasionally we lead. So in 2020, we recognized that if we didn't get off our legacy system, we would be fighting with our hands tied behind our backs. So we identified a modern fit-for-purpose system and converted onto it, which is, really not a small job. It's likened to changing an engine in mid-flight on an airplane. You're running your old system and you're converting onto a new system at the same time, and the scope for error is horrible. But we did it, and we did it, I suspect, because we're a privately family-held bank who cared about our own future many years ahead. Nearly all the big banks also should have done that, and they didn't. They sort of left it for the next chief executive, who left it for the next chief executive. And now, we're in 2026, and they're running on the 1970s mainframe computers, which no one really knows their way around. And it's a very, very serious problem.
In 2008, as the world's largest banks were collapsing or being nationalized, one small bank had the opposite problem in London. Too much money was arriving at their door. It was founded in 1672, older than the Bank of England, even older than the United States. It has survived the Napoleonic Wars, the Blitz, the Great Depression, the Cold War, the Great Financial Crisis, and actually every panic in between. It has never taken a penny of outside capital, and the partners from the family who own it carry unlimited liability. This means that if it ever fails, they lose everything they own personally. Their homes, their savings, their children's inheritance. When my guest took over, advisors told him this was madness, and I think we'd all agree, but he kept it anyway. And he believes that it is one of the pillars of the bank's success. He also told me that his real job is, in his own words, to keep the family poor. His name is Alexander Hoare, the 11th generation of his family to run Hoare & Co. And over the next 2 hours, he's going to gently shake up almost everything you've been taught about money, business, wealth, and success. I wanted this conversation because most business advice, including, I'll admit, sometimes my own, tells you to scale, to optimize, to maximize, to win. Alexander's family has done close to the opposite for 3.5 centuries, and yet they have outlasted almost everyone who didn't. So if you've ever been wondering how much money is actually enough, how do I build something that outlives me? How do I pass on wealth without ruining my children? Can you be genuinely ambitious and genuinely good at the same time? This episode is really about your questions, and I put them to a man with a 350-year-old head start on some of these answers. We get into why he turns away profitable customers, why he calls compounding the eighth wonder of the world, and yet deliberately caps it. What 2008 taught him about character, the seventh generation that lost the stately homes and the Gainsboroughs, the role of faith in all of this, and what he hopes to hand the 12th generation, whom he's actually just appointed. He once said, "I see maximizing short-term profits as the wide gate to failure." By the end of this, I think you'll understand exactly what he means. With this, welcome to the System Gambit, Alexander Hoare.
Thank you very much for inviting me on. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
So to kick this off, I think it'd be great if you could take us back to all the way back to your birth. What was it like? What was family like? Parents growing up, school, college, your first job, and until the point that you end up joining the family bank?
My mother and father married young and had no money. My father proved to be a successful stockbroker, and my upbringing initially was quite well off, shall we say. And then when I was about 12, he suffered ill health and had to retire. And suddenly my upbringing became a bit less well off. And I was very lucky, actually, that my grandfather was one of 8 siblings, and his father built a house near here. Actually, I'm speaking to you from near Basingstoke, called Danes Hill. It was designed by Lottians. And Danes Hill became a school and eventually got sold at this time. And they created a trust fund by which myself and various cousins were educated, or they helped with the school fees. So I got a good education at Winchester College, which I didn't greatly enjoy, but it was a good education. And then I went up to Edinburgh University, where I got less education and more enjoyment, fantastic enjoyment. And I studied business studies. And then I had a bit of luck. I got a job doing business studies. It was called management consultancy. And I worked for PA Consulting in the computer and telecommunications division. And I was very happy doing that until one day I was forced to change. So I had these 2 summers of doing deeply clerical work. And a bank in the early 1980s was kind of a factory pushing pieces of paper around. It wasn't a very stimulating place to work, to be honest. And so I did this work and found it somewhat stultifying and sort of last century, certainly as compared to working in data and telecommunications when I got to PA. So when the bank invited me to lunch, I went along to have a nice lunch. Then they invited me again, and they made it clear to me that they wanted me to go and work there. And I sort of declined because I was perfectly happy working where I was working. And then this sort of escalated a bit, and the senior partner's wife heard about it. And she said, look, invite him to dinner. So I went round to dinner with the senior partner and his wife. And over dinner, he was labeling it on that I could have power and prestige and privilege and money. And I was actually quite happy doing what I was doing. So I wasn't all that moved by this. But then his wife, asked me if I'd like to help her do the dishes. And when she had me completely cornered, she said, forget everything your senior partner has just told you. This is about family. This is about duty. This is about honor. You've got to do the job. And she kind of hooked me that way. And so I thought, well, let's give it a go at least. There's no harm in trying a new job.
Huh?
And
why did her sort of pitch to you work while the seniors partners didn't? Like, what do you think was the difference?
I think it probably comes down to principles. Her argument was better than his. It was immortal life and making as much money as you can. And I was more inspired to try and do my family duty than I was to just have a lot of money.
But just to understand sort of the environment you were in or the position you were in when this happened, was it that you felt you were financially completely secure and so you didn't really have to chase money? Or was it more that you were not planning a lavish life and so you were not really motivated by trying to make a lot of money? Or what was the context like? And because a lot of people listening, right, would be in a similar position sometimes and would be asking themselves, how should we think about this? How should we frame the problem, the question?
I was 2 years out of university, and I can remember my starting salary at PA was £7,800 per year.
A year?
So, yes. So I would have had 2 pay rises since then, perhaps. Might have been on £9,000. I think I'd got a company car, actually, so I was quite pleased by that. But, I wasn't living a life of riding, and I was working extremely hard. Probably didn't have much time to spend money. But I was enjoying myself. I was being very, very stimulated and very, very stretched in quite an exciting area. Well, I thought it was exciting. And I didn't think retail banking was going to be anything like as exciting as it has in fact turned out to be.
Yeah. I think yeah, sometimes you just don't know where things will go. What I was also curious about was how come, so you did intern at the bank, but how come the senior partner reached out to you? Was it because you wrote a dissertation on whether a small new bank, right, could even work? But was it because of that focus you had in your studies also that they found interesting and wanted to get you on board for?
So I think that he had identified identified me as a potential recruit long before I identified him as a potential senior partner. So he was keeping tabs on me. And I did write this dissertation. So I was in Edinburgh studying business studies when some people had the idea to create a new private bank called Adamant. And the sort of dons or professors in Edinburgh were saying it will need work. You can't set up a new wee bank. And so my strategy, my dissertation was a strategy piece on could you or couldn't you set up a new bank? And I did the sort of desk paperwork, and then I interviewed a load of bankers. And my conclusion was it would work. No reason why it shouldn't work at all. And in fact, both camps in the end were right. It did work quite well until it went spectacularly bust. Then they phoenixed it, or the Royal Bank of Scotland rescued it, and it carried on working very well until it didn't.
Yeah, and I think there were definitely probably reasons of why it went that way. But I think more importantly, it'd be important to understand. So, given this context, you then take up the job with your Aunt Karamie's pitch while washing the dishes, reminding you that this is not about power, prestige, and wealth. It's about family. It's about those values. You come on board, and as you say, right, in many senses, I'm quoting you here, you say, in many senses, my career has been a 38-year consultancy assignment. So what was it like when you entered the bank? What year was it? What did retail banking look like? And then if you take that as a starting point, can you take us all the way back to founding, right? So let's do a almost 350 year sort of summary of what the evolution might have looked like.
So there were no microcomputers in the bank. There was one mini computer, which was doing overnight runs, and that was doing the account processing. And there were a lot of people keying a lot of data into machines and rekeying it. And, seen from today's perspective, it was extremely inefficient, but it worked. And this is 1987. In 1960 something, they started their first computerized bank statements. Before that, they were written by hand. So for 300 years, it was handwritten ledgers. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. I think starting from there to where the bank has come today, you write, and I quote you again, it has pleased me to do many things wrong from a conventional point of view. So I think why this conversation is so fascinating and important is because you haven't run with the herd. You have taken pretty contrarian sort of points of view and acted on them, and they have paid off big time. And so could you take a few examples of contrarian calls, especially having to do with bank modernization, with retail banking as an industry, and with technology and the use of technology in banking?
So on technology, we are actually followers. We do most of what everybody else does. But then occasionally we lead. So in 2020, we recognized that if we didn't get off our legacy system, we would be fighting with our hands tied behind our backs. So we identified a modern fit for purpose system and converted onto it, which is, really not a small job. It's likened to changing an engine in mid-flight on an airplane. You're running your old system and you're converting onto a new system at the same time, and the scope for error is horrible. But we did it, and we did it, I suspect, because we're a privately family-held bank who cared about our own future many years ahead. Nearly all the big banks also should have done that, and they didn't. They sort of left it for the next chief executive, who left it for the next chief executive. And now, we're in 2026, and they're running on the 1970s mainframe computers, which no one really knows their way around. And it's a very, very serious problem.
Yeah, and I think when you say we're speaking of all the big industry players, right? It would be, something like a JP Morgan or a Citigroup, and something of that scale. We're not speaking of, others, smaller banks. We're speaking of really the behemoths in the industry.
So you mentioned two American ones. I'm not so familiar with them, but the big British clearing banks are all handicapped by legacy systems.
And what you did at the bank then was to wait to see how things are developing, not to jump on every new trend and exciting technology wave. But then once you built enough clarity and conviction, you really changed everything. Like you changed the entire core. So your entire tech stack was then brought up to date and made fit for purpose for the coming decades. So it wasn't that you added layer on layer on systems such that, the inner core was from the 80s, like it is for many banks, correct?
Well, you make it sound like it's nirvana. It is still a very complicated tech stack, and it's by no means perfect. But you talk about sort of waves of technology, and the leading edge is also known as the bleeding edge. So we do consciously avoid the bleeding edge and let others learn the hard way, so to speak. And then we try to be what we call fast followers, sometimes faster than other times. Where we have done something a bit different in the last 3 years is recognizing that AI is definitely a thing. We've spent a lot of time and money getting our data fit for purpose. And it's not a sort of very exciting job taking data in one state and putting it in another state. But the potential it releases is very exciting. And one paradox which emerges is that, of course, it's much easier to do if you're a small bank, you've got less dirty data to clean up. We've actually got clean data sets now.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a huge advantage. But we'll dive deeper into that a little later in the conversation. Before we continue, I thought it'd be nice if you could speak a bit more about the bank, what its origins more than 350 years ago, the ethos on which it was founded, some of the ups and downs over 350 years in with a quick stroke of the brush, and how it's set up in terms of ownership, in terms of liability, in terms of how it operates and runs from a governance perspective, just so that someone who's not familiar with Hoare and Co. gets an overview.
So the bank takes its founding date, 1672, from when my 9 times grandfather, Sir Richard Hoare, completed his apprenticeship and started trading in his own name. He was clearly a very impressive man, and as well as being a good banker, he was prime warden of the Goldsmiths Company. He was Lord Mayor of London. He was an MP for London. He must have been quite capable. And he married, one of his great decisions was marrying Susanna Austin. She gave him 17 children. So if you want to start a family dynasty, you want to get the right wife. And so he gave us some brains, and she gave us some genes of real resilience. And the bank today has got 8 partners, all descended from Sir Richard and Susanna. And we've got about 3,000 cousins, similarly descended from these two. And it evolved. The first generation, he was very successful. Second generation were very successful. And the third generation were very successful. So the normal pattern in family businesses is clogs to clogs or shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. In our case, it took 7 generations. We finally messed up.
And how do you think, why do you think that happened in the 7th generation? And if you were to just sort of look back and try to analytically evaluate what was going on, do you see it as an inevitability, or was it some macro factors? Was it just the fact that after 6 generations, people get laid back, or I don't know, what do you think is going on there?
I don't exactly know either. What we learned from it is the wealth should pass to the most capable next generation, not just the next in line. So I think what was happening is under primogeniture, whereby the eldest son inherits the biggest share of the previous generation's wealth. The wealth might not have gone to the best characters and personalities who turned out to be rather good at spending it and rather less good at making it.
That's well put, and I think this is something that a lot of family businesses struggle with, and I think a lot of dynasties have failed because of that. And to then understand the lessons learned from there and how the governance is set up today. So you have about, I think, 3,000 or so cousins broadly that are descended from the founder, and yet you have some kind of meritocratic system within that to pick the partners of the bank that have this unlimited liability. How does that work, and why do you think it's set up that way? Was it like that when you joined? Did you make changes? So what was that evolution of governance like?
So a family business is by definition nepotistic. And one reason I didn't really want to join the family business at that time is it was seen as a bit infra-dig, a bit second best, a family business. The best ones were the big tiny ones. However, it's more complicated than that, because within the nepotism, you can have merit and meritocracy. And you asked if I made changes. There are two big changes. One was kind of cataloging who all these cousins were, where the talents were, talents we had available to us, and then developing them. And the other change, which is even much more significant, is the bank I joined was all quite grumpy and competitive males. And the partnership is now 4 males and 4 females, and much richer diversity for it. And on diversity, an interesting reflection was made by our first non-family chief executive, who observed that if you are the chief executive of a big clearing bank, you are surrounded by yes men. You can't really be helped. But in our family, he observed we had young cousins and old cousins. We had city cousins and country cousins. We had musical ones and artistic ones and sporty ones, and a whole range of diversity within a single family. So there's strength in family ownership, which isn't seen in most publicly owned banks.
And that's the irony, right? You would think for a listed company that all stakeholders of society, that the diversity of society would lead to better governance, but it actually leads to a lot of dilution of meaningful ownership, and it leads to yes men, as you said. And I think that's a contrast worth drawing out, which is you might think that wide public ownership might lead to better governance, but probably, I mean, the way we experience it probably doesn't. And I think this seems to work much better.
Yeah, so theoretically, a clearing bank could decide to hire a young female cousin who's good at music, but would they? The person in HR doing the recruiting, would they actually do that?
Yeah, I think all the fun starts in HR. I say, since I was a student, I've been I do less of it now, but I still occasionally apply to a couple dozen positions that seem broadly interesting, and then I just get more or less. And I think my hit rate was 90% failure rate, 10% success rate as a graduate student, and now it's the same. Perhaps even worse. So I think, yeah, it's just I just love to test the HR entry gate to see how bad it is, and then for me it's a good sign to know I don't want to go there. So I have no regrets. That way, I make sure I have no regrets, because and usually it's like this, either it gets rejected direct, like I don't even get a response email, or I just get a generic response saying, yeah, you're the wrong guy, or I'm speaking with the owners, the partners, the CEO. So that's kind of the two scenarios. So there's no in between, which is nice.
But it gets a bit odd when their AI will start interacting with your AI.
Yeah.
You're just sort of on the edge somewhere.
Yeah, I think at that point, there are already some companies using some kind of synthetic AI type of interviews, and I really don't see the point of that. I mean, you are hiring a human being, so at least take the time to evaluate, speak with them. Like, why would you do it synthetically? And I think for me, that's all. Like, my rule earlier was, if you asked me to do some kind of very banal standardized test, I would refuse just on principle. So if it was much more a personality and understanding the person kind of test, I would do it. But just, solving, I don't know, math puzzles or something, I found that absurd, because if I have a graduate degree in math from an elite, math research institute, I don't see the point of doing math puzzles. But now my new filter is, if I have to deal with any kind of quote unquote AI, then I don't want to interview with you. So that's but speaking of that, so now you enter the bank and you start sort of taking on more responsibilities. And at some point you decide to sort of come up with a mission statement for the bank. So I think the older male, sort of more conservative partners at that time, I guess they kind of mocked the idea. They probably didn't see the point. You probably felt some pushback. So how does that come about? At what point do you decide you need a mission statement? What role are you in? Why do you think that mission statement is important? And how do you go about formulating it?
So in any business of any size, it does become important everybody understands what page you're on. I did not come up with a mission statement. I came up with a statement of what I perceived our mission to be. So the mission was.
So what's the distinction? So what's the distinction between a mission statement and a statement about what you think the mission should be? Just to sort of understand what you mean exactly by that.
So the partners before me, had been doing this, but they'd never done it explicitly. It was always implicit. And I just said that I think that what we're doing here is perpetuating a profitable family business. And they said that sort of management consulting crap. Why do we need a statement like that? And they may have been right, but the statement has stood the test of time quite well.
And I think the interesting thing is this mission statement does not set a growth target, right? It says nothing about winning a specific market. It does not say something about becoming the biggest player in the industry, right? And I think the choice of goal is so important, right? Because the mission statement in some way sets the goal. And if one thinks from a systems theory perspective, setting the goal is in itself one of the highest leverage decisions you can make for an organization. So I think the mission statement you chose is relatively unusual, but it's also very powerful and effective. So what are your thoughts on this idea of how the mission statement, which is to perpetuate a profitable family business, how has that high leverage decisions shaped so much downstream?
So, well, you're right. And you read a lot of things about winning, and it just doesn't make any sense at all, because it's a marathon, not a sprint, but it's much longer than a marathon. It's endless. So perpetuity is a really tough master, I suppose. To get perpetuity right, you've got to get a lot of other things right.
And what are those other things? Like what are those things that you think one needs to get right?
Well, I suppose in the statement, you got to have a family who wish to participate in it, and you got to have a business which works. Perpetuate a profitable family business. It's got to have profits. It's the third thing. And so far, we've done that quite satisfactorily. It's not obvious. I mean, a lot of businesses. I heard yesterday that the average S&P 250 business lasts 15 years. And it was 60 not long ago. But in any event, 350 years is a bit of an outlier. And I suppose we've done that by working hard at tending our business, making sure it's profitable. And I think we're quite blessed with the gene pool, which Sir Richard and Susanna left us. We've got quite a talented family.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think what you just said is something worth sort of double clicking on, which is that, was it the S&P 250, right?
Yeah.
So like the life of a business has gone down from 60 years to 15 years, 5 years. And I think that already tells you that there is something rotten. There is a problem in how businesses are run, especially the big public ones. But I think the logic, the environment, the toxicity is similar. It doesn't matter whether you're listed or not. I just published a review of Eric Ries's new book, Incorruptible, a few hours ago. And he defines this as corruption, right? So what I liked was the way he frames this problem, which is that there seems to be this inevitable sort of collapse into what he calls financial gravity, which is just short-term extractive practices. And I think that over time just leads to this, we're hollowing out essentially of business in 15 years instead of making it, work for perpetuity in some ways. And I think an analogy or like a metaphor I use is that of farming. I think there are all these cycles of planting, of tending, of harvesting, of replanting. And I think if one sees it through that kind of cyclicity, then this idea of extracting and quote unquote winning in the short term does not make sense. I think winning in the longer term makes sense, which is like, how do you actually survive in perpetuity and sort of grow? But this idea of let's just cut all the crop today and eat all the grain without thinking of planting a percentage of it, I think is just absurd.
I agree. In my mind, I think consumers need farms or farmers, and they need banks and bankers. My local farmer here in Hampshire caused consternation nearly 20 years ago by abandoning industrial farming. He just said, I'm not going to pour any more chemicals on my fields. He went organic. And people were very, very angry with him. You can't do that. But fast forward to 18 years and Putin invades Ukraine, and he's the one who's laughing. He hasn't got to drive tractors around with no expensive diesel and spraying horrible sprays and creating all sorts of sickness. He's got really good soil now. And I think that analogy does carry across to banking too. You can look after your soil, shall we say, or the choice is yours.
Yeah, and I think if the idea is to just sort of quickly flip the soil or flip the asset and move on, I think it's precisely that mindset that kind of gets into this absurd short-term destructive extraction mode. because if you know it's your soil forever, you just act differently.
Correct. He wants to hand this farm to his son like it was handed to him, and so he'll look after the soil.
And you said that people found it absurd. Why do you think people, like, who are these people and why would they find this absurd? Like, to me, it sounds like the right thing to do, right? But why do you think there is a set of people who think these things that actually sound super reasonable and obvious are absurd? Like, what's the dogma behind people not liking this type of decisions?
He was challenging the accepted paradigm, wasn't he?
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is a risk I see especially high today, because in what's called broadly AI today, right, you're essentially training models on existing data, and the existing data obviously by definition have been produced in the existing paradigm, which means yes, the stuff is useful, yes, you can try to use it for useful stuff, but with the strong caveat that these things are within paradigm systems, and so they will not allow you to see a new paradigm. They will not allow you to rethink a new paradigm from first principles. And I think this blindness or this over optimism in this thing is a panacea is, I think, risky. It is useful within paradigm, why not, to some extent, but it's also simultaneously blinding you more to the new to a new paradigm.
Yeah, I think that's very sound.
Yeah. Then I think, to wrap up this idea of the role of the partners and purpose in the family business, I want to ask you about the last important role that you defined for partners in the company. You said they have to do 4 things. They have to know the customers, they have to know the staff, they have to know the risks and succession. And I think each of these 4 in many ways is not the top 4 priorities of business owners, especially, or at least business operators, especially the large listed companies, but also other larger companies. People lose focus of these 4. They start looking at a whole bunch of other metrics, a whole bunch of other topics, but they neglect the customers, the staff, the risks, and succession. So out of these 4, what are your thoughts based on what you've seen elsewhere, family businesses you have spoken with or advised, other businesses you've had conversations with, and business owners? Which of these gets neglected the most, and why do you think gets neglected, and how does one fix that?
So we identified those 4 quite a long time ago, and I think I might now add a 5th or maybe a 6th. But in our internal sort of charter of how we work, you cannot retire unless there's enough people to succeed you. So succession is a very core part of our job description in a way. If ever you want to retire, you've got to have attended to succession. The risk part comes inevitably from the unlimited liability, and very, very few. Well, I can only think of one other bank which has any form of unlimited liability. So you would expect our partners to think harder about risk than the directors of any other bank, because they stand to lose everything if they get that one wrong. And I think that does happen. The customers and staff are a bit more troubling. So we do meet every new customer face to face, and there are a lot of good reasons for doing that. And in the world of AI deep fakes, I can see us going back to more face to face meetings. Might be one of the only ways of knowing who you're talking to. Knowing all the staff was a possibility 20 years ago. There are too many staff. They turn over too fast now. I can't do it. And I'm not very happy about that, because every time you add a head on your head count, you're adding unlimited liability risks. What that is for, missed out, I think, which I think will be really much more important going ahead, is thinking. The ability to think forwards, think wide, think ahead, think strategically. I think the job of a good steward will be, identifying the iceberg before you hit it.
I think that's so right, because especially what I see in the venture capital and startup space to a large extent, that I really don't align with, is this idea of, you just purely grind your way to glory. And hard work is definitely important, but you don't have to be daft and hardworking, right? You can try to be smart, reflective, thoughtful. And I think, as you said, thinking deep, thinking wide, and thinking differently, being contrarian is such an important part of this. And sometimes, I think it was, so one of my mentors shared this about one of his mentors. And it says broadly that it's easier to get someone to walk 10 kilometers than to sit for an hour alone and think. And I think I don't know what the original source of this is, but it's really true. I think it's so much easier to be seen, to move, to do things than to just sit and think.
There's a very good book on this topic called Deep Work, and we've kind of lost the skill of deep work. We respond to emails, we deal with distractions, but actually, if you want to be well paid as an expert in something, you've got to be able to get your head down and master the subject. And everywhere you see executives who are very, very distracted and not doing the deep work.
And I think you took so much time to write Impact Banker. That's something I haven't yet mentioned, but the way we got to speak the first time was when I read your book, Impact Banker. It would have taken you definitely a long time to bring your thoughts together, to think things through, to edit it, to put it together. I tried to give it the respect it deserves. I tried to put in a lot of time thinking, reading, reflecting on it, and sort of also preparing these notes to have this conversation. So we have sort of this, let's say 2 hours of public time, but there's a whole bunch of, it's like there is an iceberg of work below it, right? On in every way. Your side of the iceberg, obviously much bigger and deeper. But this idea of skin in the game, of unlimited liability, just want to go a bit deeper there because it's pretty rare. And as you said, every advisor, wealth advisor, family business advisor, everyone will tell you not to do it, right? Will say abolish this and, that will be great for you. And you even said people call you mad to keep unlimited liability. And yet, when 2008 comes, that was the real moment of madness in the industry. And suddenly you look like a very not mad person, right? This turns out to be your greatest asset. And so could you run us through this idea of unlimited liability? How did it come about? Has it been part of the bank's history since founding? What are your broader thoughts on this?
I forget exactly when Big Bang was, but late 1980s, Americans came and changed how the City of London worked forever. But up until Big Bang, with the exception of the joint stock banks, every firm was a partnership and they all traded at unlimited liability. And London was the financial center of the world. So I start from the position thinking that it's the normal way to trade. And the last 40 years have been an aberration where executives have got off scot-free for the most appalling crimes against their companies. And Big Bang was a glaring example of that. Not a single banker went to prison, and they half bankrupted the country. It's extraordinary. Our experience is if you have unlimited liability, you're kind of interested to turn up each day to work, check what's going on. And in 2008, we checked our balance sheet pretty carefully. And I remember one argument with a guy who's actually retiring this month. When I argued with him with a Casa is not a banco in Spain. Get rid of this piece of paper we had. It was some CD or floating brain note. And he got rid of it. And, we would have made a loss if that happened. Very sort of trivial argument, but lots of quite easy decisions amount to a very better balance sheet. So in 2008, we took 2 hits in our entire massive portfolio of instruments and, benefited enormously from customers and potential customers and counterparties who were looking for a bank run by people who were sensible and with a clean balance sheet.
Yeah, I think, as you say, I think the last 40 years have been some form of aberration, really, and hopefully we realize that and move away from it. What you said about unlimited liability, I think if one looks at any other facet of life, right, whether it's children, family, in all these situations, you actually have unlimited liability in many ways, right? You cannot say, oh, here are my kids and I'm not liable for what they do, right? Or this is my spouse and I'm not liable for what they do. And so in many ways I feel our existence as a species is built around this idea of unlimited liability. I think this idea of evolution and Darwinism is built on the idea of unlimited liability. So it's really strange that we somehow convinced ourselves a couple of decades ago that limiting liability would allow us to make better decisions when our entire evolution and all facets of our lives today show that it's actually unlimited liability that drives good decisions.
I completely agree. The natural order is for actions to have consequences. And you've seen limiting liabilities in the corporate world probably giving less good outcomes. And then politicians are the worst. They announce all sorts of actions with no intention of being around for the consequences.
Yeah. And I think, as you say, I think in a very deep sense, this idea of limited liability actually ends up destroying causality. Right. And so meaning your actions don't, like, the consequence of your actions is not as real as it would have been. And so if with limited liability you dilute causality in some ways of the environment, it's actually a real fudging of true signal of truth.
The other sort of collateral damage in Big Bang was, until then, the City of London worked on self-regulation. My word is my bond. And it was peculiarly effective. They replaced that with what I call tick box regulation. Their regulators were huge files, which I regard as peculiarly ineffective. So there's some moral hazard in taking away unlimited liability, washed up in a big way in regulation.
And in some ways, it's also a bit of it's a bit of a sort of short-term sacrifice. So I write about this idea of a structural sacrifice being critical to enter. It's like a cost you pay to enter a new, better system that has a structural compounding loop in the system Gambit. And so this sacrifice is the entry cost. It's not an ongoing cost forever necessarily every time, but if you think about it on a longer scale of time of perpetuity, in effect you want to have a constant sacrifice, because that is what allows you to also maintain permanent compounding. And from that perspective, do you see this idea of unlimited liability as a cost you pay? Do you see it as a signal you send to everyone, in the market, to customers, to counterparties, etc.? Or is it both?
Yes, it's important to, particularly to depositors, but all customers and staff. It's very important in our relationship with staff that, if we express a view, it's, with a serious personal cost attached to this view. But the main importance is within our own minds, I think. So we could become a limited liability company in the course of the next 2 months. But I think in the course of the next 20 years, the partners would be sitting on their yachts or whatever and not turning up at work and doing the work. It's what keeps them honest. It keeps them on it all day, every day.
Yeah, and I think, like, if someone's heard so far, you might get the feeling as if it's some kind of idealistic non-profit kind of mindset, but can you speak about the financial performance of the double-digit compounding that you've achieved as a business? Can you speak to its purely sort of financial success, about the balance sheet, about the compounding in profits, about the kind of robust growth you've managed over the last decades? Because I think this will provide us a good foundation for then speaking about, beyond just unlimited liability as a pillar, what other ways you manage to successfully build the business.
So growth is a problem, and it's not necessarily welcome in and of itself. But if you grow a balance sheet or a profit and loss account or anything else at 10% per annum, it doubles every 7 years. You're the maths guy, not me. If you grow it faster, it doubles quicker. And over my lifetime, we have done that. Most measures have grown plus or minus 10% a year every year on average for, I'm coming up for 40 years now. So if you double every 7 years, you've doubled and doubled and doubled and doubled and doubled that measure. And I pinch myself now when I look at the any of the measures, actually, they are so much bigger than they were when I joined. But there's growth and there's growth, and you can distinguish between some of these growths. The customer numbers haven't grown very much. Number of relationships we're talking to has grown not very significantly. It's grown a bit. Number of staff has maybe doubled, but it hasn't doubled every 7 years. And so we're trying to, I suppose, get the good growth and not too much of the bad growth, and keep it under control.
So on this idea of quality over just quantity, because 10% growth or 20% growth might quantitatively be the same for two companies, but there might be a massive qualitative difference. So how do you think about that, whether it's for growth, whether it's for profits? Because there's good profits and there is rubbish profits, right?
Yeah.
There's good revenue and there's rubbish revenue. And so really, a lot of this finance stuff is actually absurd because it does not really capture the quality of the business.
I completely agree with that. And if somebody replaced me with a clone who came out of the private equity industry, it would be child's play to slash costs, grow revenues, and for 7 years, put in amazing numbers and then sell it to some bigger bank. It would be a very easy thing to do, but it's hardly an attractive thing to do if you're trying to perpetuate a profitable family business. And one tension which we do have quite regularly is the management team will be trying to optimize something for the next year, 18 months, 3 years, and we'll be trying to optimize it for the next 20, 30 years. And you get different answers.
Yeah. And I think that's why what you optimize and how you think about optimizing matters. And I think from what you write about in Impact Banker, there are sort of two principles that kind of, I think, have been very important to your approach. I mean, one is this idea of keep it simple and sort of small is beautiful. And associated with that is this idea of not economies of scale, but diseconomies of scale. And I mean, it'd be great if you could sort of, from your perspective, speak about this, because sort of traditional, economic dogma taught in Economics 101 is you want economies of scale at all cost, and that is actually going to make things cheaper, that's going to make things better, etc. But that doesn't really pan out. So I think this idea of simplicity is so important and underappreciated. So do you want to speak about, name and describe what these diseconomies of scale are, right? What have you seen in the industry and how it has hollowed out much bigger competitors or bigger banks in the industry from the inside?
I can try, but I've never worked in other banks. But you don't need a lot of imagination to imagine people who are maybe 55 waiting to collect their pension at 60, don't have any great incentive to experiment and try new things. You can imagine a department in one city and another department in another city headed by two ambitious people, each ambitious leader trying to get above the other on the pecking order. And you can imagine dysfunctional, non-cohesive collaborations occurring. And then I can see customers coming to us from these big banks. And I tell you, we meet every new customer and we say, well, why have you come? And they come with the most extraordinary tales of how they've been abused by their existing bank. Totally irrational behaviors of astonishing proportions day after day after day. So there's something very wrong with these larger short-term profit maximizing banks. And then you touched on my two mantras, which I don't normally labor mantras, but I have labored these two, all my colleagues, anyone who will listen to me. Small is beautiful and keep it simple. Keep it simple, stupid. It's the KISS principle, it's called. And if you start with small is beautiful, I think we live in a world which has gone completely mental on growth and scale. I don't really understand it. And sitting outside my window, I've got a Kia Picanto. It's a tiny little car. It's absolutely perfect for what I use it in, little lanes going short distances. Why would I drive a big car?
So you don't need a big Maserati then?
No, it's absolutely not. And so small cars can be a lot of fun. Think of the Italian job. He didn't take Volvos to do the Italian job. He took Minis. Small aeroplanes and airports are much more agreeable than big ones. Small countries. Think of Singapore. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but it works really well. It's got an extraordinarily high standard of living. It appears to be sustainable. What's wrong with a small country? So size is not, to my mind, any sort of idol. And nor is the size of profits. It's the quality of profits you make that you want to be proud of. I want profits which are repeatable and you can be proud of them. You haven't done anything evil to attain them. So small scale also is important if you wish to remain a family business. And it brings in KISS. But if it would be comparatively easy to make our bank big and complicated. In fact, it would happen if I stopped turning up and stopping it getting big and complicated. What would be the result of that? A future generation, it wants to have any part of running it. Why don't we sell it? And that the mission would have been jeopardized. So the KISS part fits very nice with small is beautiful. If you can both keep it simple enough to understand and small enough to understand, then you might just be able to understand it, hand it down to the next generation, and they can understand it and hand it to the next generation.
Yeah, if it gets so big that you can't wrap your head around it, then you can't really own it and do something about it, and hence then you want to have limited liability, right? Because you just don't understand it. And so I think these two things also go together, which is if you have unlimited liability, you are incentivized, as you said, to not only not to go and hang out on your yacht, but to show up, right?
Yeah.
And take responsibility.
Yeah, and to look at that list of instruments in your treasury book and say, I don't like that one called a casa because it's not a banker. I didn't really know what I was talking about, but I happen to be right.
Yeah. No, and I think having personally experienced across my career this sort of unnecessary destructive complexity at work in organizations, I felt that simplify had to be a core sort of tenet of any organization. And something I always like to speak about is people don't realize how complexity is born. And if you think about it, no one wakes up in the morning and says, let's increase complexity, right? What happens is something breaks, someone fixes it, something else breaks somewhere, someone fixes it. So it's, at its best, it's a bunch of good intentions of people doing their job in a decentralized way across the system, trying to fix things, trying to patch things up, etc. And all of that comes together, and just like you have entropy in physics that just keeps growing in any system, you have a similar sort of growth in complexity in a business or an organization. And I think what you said was so important, because what I also argue is that you cannot simplify bottoms up. It's just structurally meaninless. Simplification has to be pushed top down, right? Meaning because the burst of complexity is a natural bottom up process, the simplification by definition hence has to come top down. And I think it's right. And so nice to hear you say it, because that's your job, right? That's your job. That's the owner's job. That's the owners who have unlimited liability, their job, because you have unlimited liability, only you can cut through the complexity and decide what simplicity means. Only you have that lens, only you have that skin in the game, and only you can look at the organization, the business, and say, this is what simple means, as the ultimate sort of decider of what simplicity is. And
I agree with what you say, except for one detail. People do wake up in the morning thinking, let me complicate things. And when I was chief executive, people came to me the whole time saying, why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? And all of these ideas were perfectly good ideas. They would have made us more money, but they would have built in a complexity premium further down the line.
No, I was trying to be very kind and optimistic when I said that, but you're absolutely right. I think there's a whole bunch of people who have actually come up with ideas to make things complex and worse. And I think one thing worth sort of double clicking here is, I think, where you chose to sell off a big chunk of your business. So you actually, decided to become smaller to reduce complexity. Do you want to explain what happened there? Because it's not the typical, sort of private equity LBO play where you buy a business, as you said, you sort of essentially destroy it by extracting and then you flip it. I think there was a very different logic of what happened there and why you exited it, right? Because everything else is for perpetuity, but in this case, you chose not to. So what was going on, and what's the lesson from it?
So in general, a bank's main income is the difference between deposits and loans. It's called net interest income. And a bank will try and earn non-interest income by charging fees for other services. And almost all private banks charge fees for investment or asset management. And we were building up an investment management business. And we were told when it got to £1 billion under management, this is a long time ago, when it got to £1 billion under management, it'd be profitable. And we gradually got there. And they said, terribly sorry, it's now 2 billion. So we spent another few years and we got to 2 billion. And they said, well, it's now moved on. And we began to think this was a bit of a I began to think this was a bit of a fool's errand. But all other banks were doing it, and they're still doing it. And I think if we'd been a limited liability public company, the easiest and most natural thing to do would have been to raise more money to hire even more better people, even bigger computers. and carry on growing that business. But we didn't want to go to the market to get external capital to do that. We didn't want to get bigger and do it anyway. So we sold it. We sold it for a very handy sum to Cazenove 10 years ago this year, I think. And the sort of implication of that is the staff headcount went down from about 400 to 300, which was a big simplification. But the real benefits were numerous. Suddenly the IT department was only asked to do banking, it wasn't asked to do investment management. And by the way, investment management's more difficult. The compliance department was only asked to do banking, it wasn't asked to do investment management. The partners were only asked to deal with banking customers, not investment customers. And the competitors, they were the big surprise in all of this. And it wasn't a surprise, but the extent of the change was surprising. The day the deal closed, firms who had previously been seen us as a competitor now started referring banking business to us because we couldn't pinch their investment business. And to this day, wealth managers are very good introducers to our bank. So all in all, we've never regretted selling our investment management business. And we actually followed up by then selling our tax business, and then subsequently we sold our trust business.
Yeah, these are such good examples. And which sort of, brings us to a bit of the paradox of size and keeping things small. So it's this idea where, you kind of knew that it would not be wise to stop growing, right? Because it would essentially result in relatively shrinking. You saw it happen to other small banks. So you said small is relative when it comes to the expansion of costs of IT, of regulation, etc. But your rule isn't just stay small. It's a bit subtler than that. So it's about growing enough to stay small enough. So what's the nuance there? How would you sort of expand on this?
Yeah, I mean, we're learning every day. We don't know the answer to the question, what is the optimal size? We know that some banks have been too small, and we know that some banks are very much too big. And I suppose we have to steer between Scylla and Charybdis. As our balance sheet has got bigger, we're able to take on wealthier customers and do larger loans, and that is more profitable than doing lots of small loans. So there are definite advantages in getting bigger. But I look at the well-known bank in our sort of area in the UK is called Coutts. They're about 10 times our size, and neither their customers nor their staff are particularly happy. So I think, well, that's too big.
So I think it's a bit by probably looking around, by observing what's going on, that you try to sort of, feel your way in a dark room, right, towards what you think is right.
Yes. Yeah. I don't know the answer. I just feeling my way each day.
Yeah, and there probably isn't also, I think. I guess, some things remain somewhat vague or somewhat a bit of a range, and you can't always pin things down to a number, right? Because this inherent uncertainty is something you can't really get rid of. You can pretend it doesn't exist, but you can't really get rid of this fundamental uncertainty.
And what was true today might not be true tomorrow morning.
Exactly. It's not a static setting. So this brings me to the next big thing, which is this idea of relationships, not transactions. I think a lot of the clearing banks, a lot of the banking industry has gone towards scaling transactions. In many ways, you've sort of scaled relationships. And why this is interesting is because I think you reject profitable business of a specific kind of person, what you call potentates. I'll let you explain what that means. But on the bright side, I think it really saves you a bunch of problems downstream. I think a lot of people were surprised how a lot of large banks and the bankers there were bending backwards to service, absolutely horrendous people like Jeffrey Epstein, for example, not to mention, a bunch of other oligarchs and drug lords and whatever else is out there. And you don't have those problems. And so the partners meet every customer in person. But I think there's a lot more to be unpacked there. So what's going on with relationships, not transactions, and why no potentates, and what are potentates? I hope I'm pronouncing the word correctly. I didn't know this word until I read your book.
So if you go back like sort of 30 years or so, the bank was arguably guilty of a little bit of racial discrimination. And the lawyers started saying, you're not allowed to discriminate on grounds of race. And we had a bit of a think, and we found that you are allowed to discriminate against potentates. So we imposed a rule, no potentates. And what that did in one stroke was eliminated almost all sultans, sheikhs, oligarchs, or princes from anywhere in the world.
And what about pedophiles like Jeffrey Epstein?
That's a different test we apply. We do apply a test to all new customers. Do they share our values and are they like me? I think he would have failed that test, but JP Morgan didn't have any problem.
Yeah.
But it's important actually that you have these tests because we are intentionally a small bank or a small team. We can't take on everyone who might want to join us. We just don't have the capacity. So you choose the ones with whom you wish to enter into a long-term relationship. And a long-term relationship is much more fulfilling and much more efficient actually than just doing transactions. And strategically, it's not intuitive until you think about it, that a small bank cannot possibly compete with a big bank on balance sheet, on global scale, on execution of transaction things. But a big bank can't possibly compete with a small bank on depth of relationships with its chosen customers. And so that's the way the world will polarize in our field, but probably other fields. Almost certainly other fields, there will be people who want really fine dining experience, and there'll be people who want to go to McDonald's. We're offering the very fine dining experience, and if you want a transaction, you can go to Big Bang.
Yeah, I think, and I think it positions you uniquely, right? You're really leveraging your asymmetric advantage by doing that. So just to make this more tangible, so could you share an example of the most profitable short-term thing you essentially turned away, right? What were some, like we have one clear example of where, you could have in the short term made money, but you said your inner voice or whatever said, no, we don't want this, or your gut feeling said, stay away from this, and why, and how that panned out.
There've been a lot. There's one in the book, I don't put a name on him, but he has been dead for easily 20 years now. No, nearly 40 years. So Boris Berezovsky, a Russian oligarch, walked in one day and to a bank which is trying to gather assets into wealth management business. He could have been quite profitable, but I read him our money laundering rules, and he went to another bank across the road where long after he's dead, he continues to cause them compliance difficulties because they don't really know what to do with this sanctioned money. So that's just one example of the sort of decision you can come up across.
Yeah, and you see that at many of the large clearing banks. I mean, I keep seeing it in the news here in Germany about how Deutsche Bank keeps getting fined in the millions and hundreds of millions. I think if you just add up the amount of fines these guys have got, it's just you could really ask yourself, was this a smart move at all, right? And on the other hand, you look at something like JP Morgan, where I think Jamie Dimon has built a bit of a cult of personality. It's sort of a relatively respected bank, and then you need one Jeffrey Epstein scandal to come out, and people are already shaking their heads, right? And so I think that the destruction and whatever little revenue that that criminal might have generated wasn't probably worth it, right?
So you touch on the ethical problem in banking, where bankers pay these fines as a routine cost of doing normal business. Now, of course, when they pay these fines, the money is coming out of their shareholders' profits, not coming out of their pockets. In our case, if we pay a fine, which by the way, I'm proud to say we never have, if we were to pay a fine, it'd be coming straight out of our own pockets, which could be why we've never paid one. And what you see in some of these banks is a very cavalier approach to compliance, actually, and to their shareholders' money. It leaves me feeling a little bit queasy.
Yeah, I think it's also why, I mean, a lot of people speak about how, investing in public markets, etc., and buying a cross section and all of that is fine. But I think when I see the way the cavalier approach to these type of things, and the way it's actually customers and investors who at the end, are left holding the short stick, I think it really makes you rethink what's going on, because who is really getting any value out of this?
Well, I can tell you, it is all in the incentives and disincentives. So I have a disincentive to incur a fine, but Jamie Morgan has got lots of incentives to take on more risk because he makes more money in total.
Yeah, but I think that's what we need to ask ourselves as a society, right? And I think we all need to ask ourselves if our experience of products and services seems to be increasingly enshittified, seems to be getting worse. If we as investors are also being, ripped off in some ways, then who's being served by this system and for what? I think so. So I think we've really worked out like why not taking on potentates and how sort of taking a short-term hit to potential business and profits actually long-term allows you to compound much better. Like you build a structural advantage, you unlock a structural advantage that allows you to compound better. And the fact that you focus on relationships over transactions, you're essentially using the asymmetric advantage you have, which is that you're small. So your cost to do transactions might not be as competitive as a large clearing bank, but your ability to build high quality trusted relationships is it's much cheaper and easier for you to do that than it would be for a large clearing bank. And so I think what happens very often is that businesses, and this is also I think how a bunch of unscrupulous sort of vendors and consultants make their money, but you go and sell best practices. So you say, let's look at these 10 players in the industry or 5 players, and this is what they're doing, so you should do that. And I think this is something that really drives me nuts. And I think it's so nice to highlight the asymmetry, the leverage that you're essentially unlocking by saying, what can we uniquely do in an amazing way that the others can't, just structurally speaking, and then doubling down on that. And then, that's your moat and that's your source of compounding at the same time.
And ultimately, in probably most walks of life, ultimately, you have to trust something or someone. You might trust your password. You might trust your ignition key. But trust, nothing works without some trust at some point. And you want to place your trust in something which is going to work. Now, I trust Amazon to deliver me a package tomorrow. 99% of the time it will come. If it doesn't come, who do I ring? How do I sort it out? It's really, really hard.
Yes, exactly. And I think as a customer, you experience a destruction of trust in ways that don't show up in the financial KPIs of the business. I mean, there's this example I think you shared of a HSBC client who was told to hand over, I think, a portfolio of 15 million or something like that, if I remember correctly from the book. And they just didn't want to do that. And they came to you and they deposited it in your bank. And I think that teaches one that big banks actually end up losing valuable customers. I have a personal anecdote here where my mom wanted to set up with some kind of locker. It's like so my grandma had some family jewelry that she wanted to sort of put in a locker at a bank, and usually what they do is they require you to do other banking services with them, and then you get this because it's they cannot offer it to all customers. And so I think we had a lot of family business with this bank. We're sitting with the general manager of the bank, and my mom's basically saying, look, this guy's visiting, he doesn't come that often, so we want to get the paperwork done and get this set up. And the general manager of the bank is on a sales call for the entire country with the chief sales officer or whoever, and he's obviously muted himself, the video is off, but we get to hear the kind of nonsense that's being spoken on that call. And the boss basically calls out one general manager after another, one city after another, and runs them through their KPIs, which is some kind of absurd thing like, I don't know, percentage growth in deposits or percentage growth in XYZ products sold or whatever. And when it's this guy's turn, he says, oh, but you haven't increased your deposits, etc. And then we realize why they were trying to force us to buy or shift products and services from another branch in the same country, just another region, another state, because all this guy was interested in was hitting his KPI so that he doesn't get mauled and insulted by his superior in that call. And all we wanted as customers was for him to deliver what we actually needed in the moment. And these two things were in direct conflict. And I think this HSBC example shows that, but it'd be great if you could just sort of expand on this, because as a customer, you feel awful. The person working in the bank, the employee, feels awful. So who where's the net benefit of this?
So your story there is about incentives. The sales rep was incentivized to deliver what he's incentivized to deliver, not what you want. And we absolutely know that customers want to be able to talk to a bank manager. And all the marketing managers of all the banks know that. But the finance director knows that the bank managers are expensive. And so they think, why didn't we automate him and give the customer an app? The initiatification begins there.
Exactly. Yeah. No, and what's worse sometimes is that the relationship. So I have a bank that changes the relationship manager every 3 months or every 6 months. It's just absurd. So before I've even spoken once with my relationship manager, they've already been changed, right?
It's not much of a relationship. And the other
Exactly.
thing which you touched on is these big banks don't know how stupid they're being. So the customer who came to us because he didn't want to invest at HSBC was one. I had one this week whose bank he'd been with, he and his wife had been there for 50 years. They refused to open a charity account for him and his wife. So now they've lost 2 good customers. I mean, it's really dim.
Yeah. So I think what we did now was really sort of understand also how this approach to doing business is actually meaningful. It might not be short-term extractive, but hey, what's the point if you harvest the existing crop on the field, but you don't really plant anything meaningful for the future, right? So
Yeah.
because we're not fruit flies that live, I don't know, a few hours or a few days, right? So I don't know why we run businesses like fruit flies. That does not make any sense. So now comes this idea of, you sort of have a marketing background, you were a consultant. I want to speak with you about what branding can't buy. So you run one of the most respected names in banking by your own account with really almost no marketing, right? And I find that strategy rather brilliantly subversive, right? I'd like to understand what's going on here. You're spending less and yet you're kind of getting more. So what's going on there?
Yeah, it's not that we don't spend on marketing. We don't spend on advertising. We never advertise. And we very, very seldom sponsor. We only sponsor if we have a specific reason. We do spend quite a lot of money on our premises. So we've got a fabulously beautiful building with a wonderful garden. And so if you happen to be in London or the southeast of England, you can enjoy looking at that, perhaps. It acts as a slight ad. But the real thing is, do people want gimmicky adverts or do they want a really good service? And if they do want to come to the bank, do they want to come or not to the bank? If they want to go to Wimbledon, do they want to go to Wimbledon to be treated like any other customer at any other bank? Or do they want to go and actually play tennis with some amazing other customers in somebody's private house? The latter being an experience no other bank can organize and which we can organize quite easily. So what we do organize is events where our customers can convene in what is essentially their clubhouse and mull over some topic of the day together. And that's quite special. It's difficult. I think it'd be very difficult for big banks to do it the way we do that.
And so this is something I deeply believe in, and it's really nice to see it at play at your business. But this idea of of demand and word of mouth really being what drives scalable, sustainable, profitable growth over time, right? That's the one and only lever, one and only channel really to get things going. And you seem to have built sort of a 350 plus year old brand almost entirely on this principle. And I'd like to sort of pick your mind on what you think about this idea of word of mouth, how it can be really engineered and accelerated, to drive the high quality kind of growth and profitability that you're interested in, right? And what part of this has to be earned slowly over decades and centuries, right? Because word of mouth, I think, is not something it's not like, Google ads or, adverts in the tube or something. It's not like there's a price tag to it, right? And so there is an aspect of it that has to be earned slowly, but I'm sure there are also aspects of it that can be engineered and accelerated. And in this case, probably based on your unique asymmetric advantages, which means anyone else listening cannot necessarily just copy their way to success.
So you and I think, agree a lot on the importance of face-to-face communication and word of mouth. But there's a slight irony that we're talking on a video call from 2 different countries about
I hope we get to meet in person and do it in person someday, but yeah.
Yeah.
in the interest
And
of time and
I,
convenience.
I wrote a word of books in the end, which is how we connected. So I think you need a range of medium pulling in the same direction. And we get about half of our new business referred by existing customers and about half referred by other channels. And that's not a bad balance, actually.
And to be honest, I think the way I discovered your book was also through one of your customers. If I remember correctly, it was Edward Chancellor who posted
Yes.
about your book. And I've never met Edward, when we've never spoken with him or don't know him personally, but I read his book and really liked it. And so I automatically assumed that, he has good taste. And so then I went and read the book and I really enjoyed it. And that's how we connected actually initially. So yeah, that's again.
His book is a masterpiece. It's called The Price of Time, and it's much, much more scholarly than mine.
Yeah. No, but I mean, that's how you see also sort of how this wheel turns, right? Like how it just pulls. It's almost like there's this idea of financial gravity that Eric Ries speaks about, right? That pulls companies down. And in some ways, you're able to construct a different form of gravitational field that just pulls the kind of people you want closer, right?
Very high caliber customers come to us. And one idea which amuses me is to be the banker's banker. And we've got an awful lot of top bankers who choose to bank with us. And that sort of tells me we must be doing something right.
That is incredible, right? Like if the bankers come and bank with you, that's like, I don't know, it's like if you're the surgeon or something like that, right?
Yes. Yeah.
If the people who are in the craft trust you, I think that's a pretty good sign. So I want to move on to this idea of obliquity. I think it was John Kay that you quote. I might have met him in person in passing because I was involved in the new Institute for New Economic Thinking after 2008. John was on and off there. I don't remember if I was at one of the conferences at OECD in Paris, I think in 2015. But I've kind of followed some of his work, read some of his work, and I find that really fascinating. And what you say is that you have used this idea of obliquity to build compounding value, because you say compounding is the eighth wonder of the world. I think a lot of people say it, but the way you've really sort of built it over decades is fascinating. So do you want to sort of speak about that? How did you approach it? What was it like at the outset? How did you approach it? How do you think about it? How did you define and construct obliquity that then resulted in compounding over decades?
I don't think we did it consciously. What was amazing was to read his book and find out that we had been doing it. So he made the expression of.
Yeah, if I may interrupt you, that's exactly the way I feel, right? I've been writing about stuff, and of course one finds examples, and then I read your book and I say, like I was kind of thinking of the theory, and then you see it happen. It's just, it's amazing.
So for listeners who don't know, Professor Kay wrote a book called Obliquity, in which he said, if you wish to approach any particular target, what you shouldn't do is approach it directly. You should approach it obliquely from the side. And the example he used, one of the two examples he used right at the beginning, was ICI, Imperial Chemical Industries, was a great company. And then a whole lot of sort of hotshot MBAs decided to maximize shareholder value. And in pursuit of maximizing shareholder value, they destroyed the business. And his point is that if you want to maximize shareholder value, they should have tried to make great chemicals or give great customer service or do something which would be better than destroying the business. And we do practice this thinking. I have been practicing thinking long before I read the term obliquity. We've never, ever, ever tried to maximize. We've got no interest in maximizing profits. We want to build the highest quality business we can build to hand down to the next generations a safe, high quality, predictable business. But it turns out that not maximizing profits has been a very profitable strategy, and we are probably one of the most profitable banks around. So that's why I like obliquity. He also wrote another book with Mervyn King called Radical Uncertainty. And in that, I think the main message I took from that is models are all very well and good and interesting, but for goodness sake, don't believe them in the real world setting.
I think that's very much even the definition of what a model is, right? It's an abstraction that could represent reality, but doesn't have to. The thing I want to highlight is that you speak about the importance of compounding, but in many ways, you also actively choose to cap it slightly in the short term, meaning like you said, you could extract a bit more profits over, let's say, a year even or 2 years. So not just a quarter, a month, or a quarter, but like over a slightly longer period. And yet you choose not to. And I think there are a lot of examples like this from a bunch of companies, some, one or two retailers around the world that purposely keep prices low. They make sure their profit margins don't go beyond a certain rate because it means they're giving that value to customers. I think it's the Nick Sleep analysis and his partner, I forget his partner's name, but like when they analyzed Amazon, when Amazon, the retail business, wasn't making any profits, what they were essentially doing is passing it on to the customer through faster delivery, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's this idea of your profits are coming at a cost. It's coming at your customer's cost, your suppliers or whatever else. So you if there is a certain potential pool of money on the table, you take a fair share knowingly, to leave a fair share for others involved to keep the thing going on and compounding. So what are you like, have you reflected on what this meant in practice? Do you have an example, or how do you think of this idea of compounding is important, but once in a while you might want to put the brakes on, keep the compounding machine going?
So I think to you and me, it's kind of common sense not to gouge your customers. You will end up losing your customers. We've been enjoying quite relatively high margins in recent years, which gave us the latitude to set up big projects to clean up our data whilst the sun was shining. Sun won't always shine. So having a long-term view really helps you decide when you can invest in things which are faintly discretionary. And if you're owned by a private equity owner, you'll just simply not do the investment. You'll take the profit.
And I think sort of mapping this idea to your personal life and your approach to investing, you speak about how you prefer to invest money to do useful things rather than buying secondhand shares. And this is a discussion I've had in the family with my uncle too, who's constantly basically said, and I think there's a bit of that ethos in the family and environment I grew up, which was also around, it's not about the money, right? This oblique approach of saying, yes, of course, it is like, you need the money and you want it to grow and compound and all of that, but that's not the direct goal you go towards. And at no point should you just make a living from rent or some form of passive income, because there's a bit this idea where a lot of people in my generation have this goal of, I want enough passive income so I can sit at the beach, right? And I think it's probably people who've never sat at the beach at a stretch, because I think after a few days you really go crazy, right? I don't know, I love the beach, but after a few days I just start losing my head. So
a few hours.
yeah. So I think there's this idea of doing the productive stuff, because that is actually what's rewarding. And of course, you want it to be financially viable, etc., and all those things are important, but it's really about doing these useful things. And what that also then leads to is that it's errors of omission, right, and not commission, because essentially what you're doing is building a portfolio of opportunities. So what have been your sort of thoughts and experiences around this, and how could someone, let's say early in their career or mid-career, at the end of their sort of professional life, how could they think about this idea of doing useful things instead of just becoming rent seekers?
It's very, very complicated, and I'd love to tell you that I don't have what you call passive income, but in my pension plan, you're not allowed anything else. You're only allowed to invest in quoted stocks, which collect rent. That's what they do. However, slightly disturbed by that, I was a pioneer in the impact investment business in the UK. And in conjunction with a co-founder, we looked around and we couldn't find a single institution who were investing consciously for consciously, intentionally investing for measurable social impact. So we created our own impact investment firm called Project Snowball. It became called Snowball. And a lot of people say they want to invest in line with their values. When push comes to shove, quite a lot of them don't. They carry on investing in manufacturing things which then need fixes out of philanthropy down the road. But Snowball continues. It's now part of a firm called Tribe, which only tries to invest consciously and intentionally for good effects. And I hope that this way of thinking about investments will endure. Yesterday, on NASDAQ, a company listed in which I was a founder shareholder. That's kind of pleasing. It's pleasing, yes, because I made a lot of money on it, but it's much more pleasing that my investment helped hundreds of thousands of people now to be well on the way to creating a much better world for mankind. That's what I call a good investment, a high impact investment.
Yeah. And I think in some ways also, like, running the family business is a bit of that, right? And you have a nice quote from The Economist, because I think it recently carried an article on family businesses and succession. And the conclusion is beautiful. It says a family business is not a business you inherit from your parents. It is a business you borrow from your children. And I think you're describing the same thing, but just what lens if you look at it from now into the past, it looks like something you're inheriting from the past generations, while if you choose to project yourself in the future and look back, you're actually borrowing it from your children. I think that is just there's just so much richness in that one sentence. So what are your thoughts on that, and how has that shaped this idea of ownership, time horizon? How do you pass on those values to the next generation?
Well, if we remember back to my discussion of the seventh generation, we learned from that the ownership should not automatically go father to son. So I have a 12, nearly 13-year-old son who has no right to expect any shares in Hall's Bank, because when I retire or die, the shares go back to the bank and get allocated on the meritocracy basis to the cousin around. And so what he has to do when he's 25, 35 or whatever, if he wants to get hold of some Hall's Bank shares, he's got to be the best of his generation, which I think is a very, very healthy thing. And it's healthy for me too. So I mustn't get too attached to material things. So these shares bring a material income. But how much income do I need? I'm 64. I've got most of the things I need. I've been through the expensive part of life. And you do see people get attached to making money for money's sake. It doesn't sit very comfortably with me. And, I want my son to earn his own money. He's beginning to do that and enjoying it. I'm happy about that.
Yeah. And I think the embodiment of that in some ways, right, is the office at 37 Fleet Street. It's the museums. And you kind of write that the building itself seems to do a lot of work, because, the private house, the museum seldom fail to impress and make a favorable impression, I guess, on customers, but probably also on the next generation and on all the sort of wider family. And this, I think, was acquired about 250 years ago. And in many ways, probably this is what durably carries your brand forward, right? It's this physical location is very much linked to the identity of the bank and the family. And this is something that no competitor can really copy, rent, or buy, right? I mean, there is no amount of money through which they can copy the heritage, right, or rent or buy the heritage that is wholly unique to you. And I think that's a huge strategic differentiator. And I think it's not really spoken about in marketing. I think we just speak about, can you growth hack this or that channel? While I think building this heritage is, I think, eventually the most unique and the most durable moat any business can build. And that's why this idea of perpetuity is so powerful when strategizing about what to do.
Just as an aside, every year we have to produce annual accounts, and we have to put a number in there for the value of this building. And a surveyor will come around and look at it and think, this building is absolutely useless for any normal modern business, which it kind of is, but it works well for us. We've evolved it exactly for how we need it, not how the market needs it. The location decision was in 1690. And it was forced on us. We were at the end of Cheapside, the St. Paul's end of Cheapside. And Sir Christopher Wren started making a hell of a noise building a cathedral. So my ancestor had to move just because it was too close to St. Paul's. And he located on the main thoroughfare, halfway between the City of London and the City of Westminster. Brilliant decision for loads of reasons. One is that to this day, if I'm going to either the City of London or the City of Westminster, I first ask myself, can I walk? But more importantly, it explains in a large part, I think, of why out of hundreds and hundreds of small family banks are survived. I think it survived because it was in a very, very good location, surrounded by lawyers and professional people who used the bank. Whereas if you'd inherited the bank in Penzance, it would have been good whilst the fishing was good. But then it would have been bad, which in fact happened. So the location is good. There was another whole part to your question. How did your question begin?
Yeah, it was this idea of the museum and your legacy, your heritage being actually your most unique moat. long term
Yes.
for perpetuity, basically, and just getting more and more valuable over time. Right? It's something that compounds over time naturally, as long as you don't actively destroy it. I think you don't even have to do much, in the sense of you don't have to actively sweat something out every day. You don't have to grind it out. I think the nature of life is such that this is something that you just keep compounding.
No, this is a really important subject. If you look or consider the Warburg's Bank, their institute is much more important now than corporate memories. It's much more important than the bank. Banker Seller has created an institute of their archives. The Rothschilds' archives are beautifully maintained in a different building just across the way. Banker March has got amazing museums. I think that our archives should outlast the bank. I hope the bank will perpetuate itself, but if I want the archives to perpetuate themselves even longer. And more importantly is this. We've got every debit and every credit of every customer for 300 plus years. If and when, actually it's when we can transcribe them into a machine readable format, indexed appropriately, then apply maybe a small language model, a bit of AI of some sort, then you can ask the most amazing questions. What happened to the customers of Hoare's Bank after the summer of 1816, but no summer? Which customers were making and losing money on ritual railroads, and what were the common factors in the lucky ones and the unlucky ones? What customers were backing William Wilberforce in the abolition of slavery, and how much of their wealth did they put towards this? And there's endless questions we'll be able to dig deeply into.
Yeah, I think that would be really fascinating, because in some ways you could generate your own history, right? So you take this data set and you could ask questions of it, and of course it's not completely representative. Like it's not like an academic historian sort of studying a period from every angle. But I think what would definitely give you is a unique set of insights based on a very clean and interesting data set.
So I'm not an academic historian, but the ones I speak to salivate at the raw data we have. They don't normally have such granular good data.
Even as a non-historian, just as a data math guy, I'm this sounds like a wonderful thing to work on. This idea of trust being that asset that builds slowly, right? So we spoke about the heritage, the location, and all of that, but also trust being that important, because you say, our success is built on our reputation and the trust customers place in us, developed over generations, but it can also be lost in a matter of days. I kind of argue that you cannot buy trust or a shared history. Right, this is something, and I think that's why I also argue that is a compounding position versus a whole bunch of other, short-term productivity or efficiency hacks, which everyone seems to be excited about. You can only deliberately build, accumulate, and compound trust, right? And in a world where everything becomes more and more copyable, right, everyone can sort of throw their sort of LLM or AI model at something and try to copy something. I want to ask you whether trust is simply one of the last uncommoditizable assets that can compound from your perspective in value. And how do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm just hesitating. You asked if trust is it an asset or is it a state of mind or an attribute? It's a very intangible and very important thing. And when a new customer walks into our bank, they see a nice building, they see a lot of heritage. It's still a big ask to say, trust me with all your wealth. And we don't tend to do that. We say, why don't you test us with some of your wealth? And you build trust from there. And the flip side of losing trust is kind of scary. In the UK, probably 25 years ago, there was a fashion jewelry shop called H. Samuel. And the principal of that was at a big industry dinner, I imagine, where he said, I sell a lot of crap. He absolutely trashed his business in one night. totally trashed it.
And which kind of leads, like this idea of trust kind of leads to the next important question, right? Which is that in many ways, banking is not that complex a thing, as you say. It's as I think it was Henry Hoare. You can tell us where he comes in, in the story of the 350 plus year old story of the bank. But he basically said that banking is quite straightforward if you merely avoid the mad and the bad. And the question is, how do you actually tell the mad and the bad from the merely unlucky or unconventional, right? Because from afar, things might look mad or bad when they aren't. And how do you think about that judgment?
So Henry Hoare was my mentor, whose wife persuaded me I should join the bank. And he was a great
So
banker.
he's the one who promised you a lot of fame and wealth. And influence.
Yeah. He's a great banker. And in a sense, it doesn't matter if they're bad or unlucky. Those are the ones you should avoid. And some people are unlucky, actually. You spot some customers that seem to be lucky, and you spot others who just seem to be unlucky. And it is luck to some extent. So you get a feel which ones are better ones to. And how do you start? Well, you start by meeting them. You meet every customer before they become a customer, and in that process, you can bowl out some.
And I think that allows you also to keep track of the C's that you speak about. So you speak about the dangers, right? Which is complacency, coziness, cousins, competence, cock up, and conspiracy. So you argue that you need to make your own luck. And what does that actually mean? And what are these alliterative C's about?
Making your own luck I don't think it's complicated. Some people might. I think it's about going out and about, putting yourself in luck's way. The tricky bit is recognizing when you've had a stroke of luck. Some people are offered a gift horse, sort of turn the other way sometimes. They don't realize what an amazing bit of luck they're being offered. And so we work quite hard at just meeting a lot of people in a lot of different situations with a radar going, is this good luck or bad luck in front of me?
Yeah, I think that is so core to your success, right? From what I gather. And this one thing I want to sort of speaking about reputation and risk and luck, you leave out reputational failure from the formal register on purpose, right? Because you essentially argue that it's the symptom of every other risk crystallizing. And I think that's a very deep point from a systems thinking perspective, because the most important risk is often the one you can't really list or you don't want to list because it's downstream from all the others. And so if you act upstream, you don't have to really think about the downstream risk. So there is this sort of hierarchical causal structure to risk, and I think that's a really important distinction. So I'd love to have you expand and reflect on that.
So it is now listed there on the risk register. That was historic when it wasn't. But the truth is, the easiest way to spoil a reputation now would be a regulatory fine, a cyber heist, all these other things on the risk register are what would catalyze a reputational risk still.
And I think the most important sort of theme running through the whole book and your work, and it's something that I really resonate with in probably the deepest way, which is this idea of, and I quote you here, "It has pleased me to do many things wrong from a conventional point of view, knowingly ignoring best practices, beware the experts, and refusing the FT columnist's verdict that small banks were neither desirable nor possible," right? And the unique angle is, how do you hold a contrarian point of view for decades without sometimes asking yourself, am I just being stubborn, right? Because anyone listening will ask themselves this question, right? It's about intellectual courage. It's about resisting consensus. And when you do that, I think there are moments where you really doubt yourself deeply.
You have feedback loops, though. So all day long, we're talking to customers, many of whom are attracted to that way of thinking, and they encourage you. And then the ultimate feedback loop is at the end of the year, did you make more money or less money than the year before? So if you keep making more money, you're probably not going too far.
And I think that's such a good point, which is when in doubt, make sure you have a closed feedback loop, right? That's not open, that the feedback is coming in, and that ideally it helps you get better feedback and etc. Because if you get that right, then you can hold a contrarian position much longer.
Yeah, and I could imagine a day when they say you're wrong, it's time to change your position.
Now, thankfully, you are contrarian, because let's say there was a bit of an unscrupulous sort of vendor or consultant kind of scoundrel who came over to you and said, you need to fire half your staff today because we can replace it with AI and reduce your costs, right? You would probably say, you would probably not let them in, right? And that's because I think one of the sort of core pillars that you speak about in terms of the bank is knowing and keeping the staff, right? So do you want to expand on that? How did that become important? There is a personal, very powerful story about your grandfather Bertram and what he did with a handful of staff while bombs were dropping. So do you want to share that powerful anecdote? And I think it has also something to do with the watch that you might be wearing right now, or at least a watch. Yeah. Okay, lovely. Let's do this. This is a lovely story, I think, that everyone should
But
know.
let's just sort of start in the today. There are three quite important, forgotten word, sort of counterparties. You've got customers, you've got staff, and you've got owners.
Mhm.
And from the selfish point of view of the owners, it suits us to do the business with people we like. It's more efficient too. And it suits the customers to have long-term relationships with people they like. So the relationship between staff member and customer is important. The relationship between partner, owner, and staff should also be long and enjoyable. In fact, in my book, I don't know if you noticed the word fun comes up quite a lot. It should be fun. And the relationship between the customer and the partner can also be fun, and it should be intergenerational. It should be very long lasting. To me, that's common sense, but common sense ceased to be common a long time ago. It's very, very rare to find a bank thinking, we want long-term staff. As you say, they're trying to farm them. It's a bit of a stretch to apply that thinking to my grandfather. In the war, he was an air warden, and he was actually an air warden for quite a chunk of Fleet Street on a terrible night, 10th of May, 1939, when a huge amount of damage was done. He, nonetheless, equipped the bank with all sorts of precautions. And he told me this, that if a firebomb hit, you had about 5 minutes to get to it. If you could get to it in those first 5 minutes, you could deal with it. And if you didn't, your building was gone. And he dealt with the firebombs, but the building caught fire somehow. And there was him, and there were 5 maids and something called a stirrup pump. I don't quite know what a stirrup pump is. But he and these 5 maids fought the flames all night long. Twice a maid fell off a roof into the fire, and they dragged her out and got her pumping again. And eventually the wind changed, actually, and they were able to rest. I suppose you could say the story there is people's loyalty to an organization, their amazing loyalty to an organization in which they had no equity. My grandfather was not a partner, he was just a property manager. But people do want to do their best, actually. And under pressure, people will do amazing things, particularly if you've got the right culture. So we work very, very hard on culture, trying to make people bring them best selves to work and be willing to give of their best. And that's important.
And how do you do that? Because I think a lot of people a lot of people don't bother with it. But I think there are a few people who definitely care about it and want to do it well. What are your sort of reflections and lessons learned on how one could do that well?
It's a complete tragedy that I think maybe most people on Monday morning leave their sort of integrity on a hook behind the front door and go to work and do something they really don't believe in and they hate, and it makes them ill. And then on Friday night they go home and they're all nice and family men again. That's a real shame. Tragic. But in our case, we have this purpose to be good bankers and good citizens, and we encourage all of our colleagues to be good bankers and good citizens. And that is motivational for them. They know that in doing good work, good banking work, they're also doing good citizen work. And our staff satisfaction scores, which feedback loop we measure all the time, are very, very high. I mean, off the charts.
So there is now a very important point that I would like to come to. And I think in many ways is somewhere where sort of Impact Banker and my sort of new book, The System Gambit, really come fused together into one. And that's when I also reached out to you asking if I could quote your business as proof of this idea. And it is signal quality over volume, right? You write in your book that JP Morgan has over 1,000 data scientists, whereas you just have a handful, and you say you rather pity their data scientists. So there is this dogma, like we spoke about, a lot of economic dogma and a lot of finance dogma. But in my field, there is a lot of dogma around we need more data. We need as much as possible. And it's again the same dogma of size and scale and more of things. And just like we spoke about, there is quantity of profit, quantity of revenue, quantity of growth. There's quality of profit, quality of revenue, quality of growth. And then similarly with data, there's just this obsession on quantity. And there is a reason why you pity the thousands of data scientists at JP Morgan. Can you expand on this idea and the mechanism behind it?
So at a sort of superficial level, AI relies on big data. And the bigger the data, the better the AI superficially. But in reality, it does help if you know what data you collected for what purposes in what systems from what people. And we do know that. And if I've never been a data scientist at JP Morgan, I don't know, I'm speculating, but I imagine they have hundreds of thousands of systems and loads more data than they ever will be able to use because they've no idea what they collected it for and what it means even.
And I think it's this idea of having high quality signal at the bottleneck, right? Of closing the feedback loop at the core bottleneck, because that's what's valuable. And I like this from the history of your business, the idea of the PS card, right? Which your relative Hoare invented in the 1950s. So it was one card per customer. And what was this thing? And what was it? What was he trying to achieve with that? And what do you think is like a durable sort of message from there?
So PS card was one piece of card, and it was tactile. You could feel it. And you could feel how often it had been used and how many other people have felt it. And it had a sort of general notice box, I suppose, which gave you a snapshot of what you'd want to know about a customer. And on one side, you had all the facilities we granted in chronological order, and different people had signed them off, and they were for different reasons. And on the other side, you had all the collateral of security they had supporting these facilities. And it was remarkably effective because you could interpret from people's handwriting things which they would never write.
That is so powerful. Yeah. And speaking of data, right?
Data protection, information security stuff, there was sort of codes going on in there. And these cards, as they age, they accrued meaning, which no computer system will ever do, actually. But the computer systems are getting quite good now, and we can now get a snapshot of a customer and all their procedures and all their collateral. But it's not as handy, actually, as a piece of card which you can turn over. You have to go from screen to screen to screen.
Yeah, and I think the core purpose of data and algorithms broadly is about operating within some kind of causal model, right? That is true. And I think what happens in like the modern data lakes and data warehouses or lake houses, as some vendors like to call it, at the end, that causal model gets flattened and destroyed or not, or not, really structurally embedded in decision making. And I think that is sad. And I think what this idea of capturing high quality signal at the core bottleneck, in this case the relationship with the customer, or like at the core sort of feedback loop, is so much more valuable than just having a lot of data lying around.
Yes. And if I now look at a screen, I can see which previous partner approved whatever it was, but I can't see if they approved it willingly or unwillingly. There's no nuance. It's black and white, the digital world.
Correct. And yet I think what your advantage is also is the fact that you have there's adaptability over planning, right? So you can't plan 5 years forward, right, when you don't have a clue what will happen in the next few weeks. But in many ways, you're able to approve a big loan, you're able to execute on impactful big decisions with the speed that a much larger organization with a lot more data and more staff might not be able to do. So what are your sort of thoughts and learnings on that? And
it's very, very important. So part of it's a trust. So if you trust that customer, regardless of whether the data is completely correct. Actually, the trust is more important. So that accelerates the credit decision enormously. Although the regulator doesn't help. But part of it also, you're talking about strategic planning. And there's some German general, von Moltke or somebody said, no plan survives contact with the enemy.
Mm-hmm. I think it was von Moltke, yeah.
That's
Prussian.
Right. So if you know your plan's not going to survive contact with the enemy, don't sweat it too much. What you can sweat, which will absolutely help you when you get into contact with the enemy, is your culture of doing the right things for the right people and doing them for the right reasons. And that has really stood the test of time for us. So, I could imagine not writing any more plans because, why bother?
Yeah, that's very true. And I think This idea of culture probably goes beyond just the bank and the staff, right? Because you have a wider family today of about 3,000 cousins, and you see them as an asset, not a liability. And how do you carry that culture forward to this large pool of cousins in the most general sense? And why do you see them as an asset and not a liability?
So they have lots of important roles. One, of course, is breeding, succession. That they are the succession plan in a sense.
Yeah.
So that's a
It's the
reason.
most essential Darwinistic role, right? Like you have to, if you don't survive, what are you there for, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah. Now they're doing okay because they started at 1 and they've got to 3,000 over 11, 12 generations. But another is many of them are customers. And that is really precious because if we have some service which is going slightly off the rails, they are very, very quick to tell us. It's not so easy to tell whoever the chief executive of Barclays is, he's got a problem. But we get that information straight away and we act on it.
and you probably have a multi-generational slice, right? You probably have people who are retired, you probably have people, midway in their life, and you probably have some teenagers,
Students.
right?
Yeah.
Students, right?
Yeah.
And so you get that signal across a person's, across the sort of life and the experiences and phases of someone's life, right?
It's what you'd call a quality signal, and it's a rapid one. You get it very, very fast. Others are just good ambassadors. They connect as they see fit. And then there are some weird things happen. We had a cousin who was a student. She was studying Euripides' Trojan Women. It's a play by Troy. And the next thing she knew, we gave her our charitable trust put some money towards putting on this play in a Jordanian refugee camp. And then these Jordanian refugees started touring this play, and then other people started copying it. And a little bit of money and a clever cousin had tremendous social impact. And then we employed the cousin for several years.
That's I think you have these like broadly one could just call emergent phenomena, right? From if you have a pool that's big enough and connected enough, you have these beautiful emergent sort of phenomena and positive synergies that emerge that you can't really
Interesting thing.
model or right. You can't really model or predict or sort of forecast these type of things.
Yeah. Happens all the time. Really curious, exciting, fun things. And actually another thing is, if I want to know anything, I can usually ask one of the cousins. Anything under the sun.
Yeah. And I think that's such a big advantage because you don't have to go through a large hierarchy or, because there's a bit of signal loss the more steps you have. And I think, as you say, if you can kind of, they're probably doing a bunch of things, they have a bunch of ages. And so you have a pretty diverse pool that you can sort of go and learn from.
Yeah.
There's also this idea of your job being, to keep the family poor. I think that's something I'd love to understand, because you say, I sometimes quip, and I'm quoting you here, I sometimes quip that my job is to keep the family poor. And the other quote that's very interesting is you say, perhaps we should be glad of the antics of the seventh generation, right? And so most people would think, it's just about let's just make as much money as possible, as soon as possible, etc. What is going on here?
Well, I'm not doing a very good job of keeping them poor at the moment because times are quite good. But what we saw with the seventh generation is they got rich, very rich, and probably lazy and entitled. And what I mean by keeping the family poor is they need to be hungry. They need to be curious. They need to have a certain amount of ambition. They need to work. Otherwise, they could just sit on the beach and be miserably unhappy. And we do see a range of customers, rich customers. Some are very, very happy and fulfilled, and some are very unhappy and unfulfilled. Guess what? The ones who work and have got some purpose in life are happier than the ones who don't.
Yeah, and I think for anyone having doubts, I mean, it sounds very privileged talking like this, but I think for anyone having doubts, I mean, just find a place where you can ramp down your costs and just experience that sense of not having to do anything for a few weeks, and I think you'll know what it means. It's hell. I know it sounds very privileged, but yeah, it's But I think a very important topic. That's something that I think a lot of people ask themselves, haven't really sort of wrapped their heads around. Is something that I'm increasingly personally interested in is how do you not let money ruin your children? It doesn't really matter how much money, right? I mean, it's you can have as big a range as you want there. But this idea of if you are so focused on perpetuity and on succession, then an important question that leads to is this idea of, okay, how do you pass on money from one generation to the other? And how do you make sure it doesn't ruin them?
And here we're talking about parenting, and each parent's got a slightly different vision of how to do it to every other
So I
parent.
guess, there might be some principles that are probably generalizable, and then there will be specifics. And I think you can speak at both, you can speak to both because I think they're both valuable.
So we come across families who are determined to keep their children in ignorance of how much wealth they will inherit. And that is, I think, storing up a problem for the day when they do find out. Wouldn't it be better to teach them a little bit about money with small sums? Nearly 13-year-old son, he's going waitering this Sunday, my next door neighbor. He'll earn 20 quid, but it's the whole process of learning that you can earn money is what we want to teach him, and then how to enjoy his money. It might be saving it up for something in the future, or it might be buying sweets tomorrow. I don't know, but you can guide a child through the benefits. You can guide a slightly older child on the journey of giving money away. So we have family charity solutions to help families give together. You can and should find your children work experience. You should encourage them to do internships, and I think there are things which are better practice than just keeping them ignorant.
And you actually advise, I think, clients and their families on how to do this better, right? This is something that comes up, and I'm sure people walk up to you and ask you this.
Yeah, I mean, to say we advise makes it sound like it's an advisory service for which we charge. We don't do that.
Not as a charge, sir, but just like, I guess, people pick your mind on this.
But yeah, we have these conversations, and the question which sometimes unlocks things is, what's the wealth for? Or when you're dead, what do you want your wealth to have done? And people don't like thinking about their mortality, but it does actually crystallize some quite hard thinking. And another question I use a lot is, do you do anything philanthropic? 99 out of 100 will say yes, or some who don't. But the ones who say yes, then suddenly you're finding out what they're actually interested in. They won't have told you unless you ask them the right question.
Correct.
And then you can help them. You say, oh, I know a customer's got exactly that interest, or whatever.
Yeah, and I think it's about asking that right question. And I remember one question that kind of really went straight to my heart. I had a friend, Bogumil Baranowski, on my podcast, and he said he used Everest as an example. He said, it's now become almost like a badge of honor, and you've got hundreds of people, I think, a day going up just to say I've been, on Everest. But the question he said he uses to sort of understand his purpose better is, what mountain would you climb if no one knew you were climbing it? So, if you couldn't say I climbed Everest, right? And I found that so beautiful, poetic and powerful and philosophically deep at the same time. And when you say mountain, it's not, it doesn't have to be an actual, like a physical mountain. It's just an image of what you want to do. And I think asking yourself that is just such a very effective sort of question to uncover a meaningful answer.
I'll tell you a mountain I'm setting off on, and I haven't spoken about this widely before. I want to try to reverse the degradation in the marine environment along the whole of the south coast of England. So this will be a voluntary initiative to restore and heal the seagrass, the seabirds, the fisheries inshore along the south coast of England. And I convened a lot of the relevant parties this week. And they all said, this is going to be extremely difficult. It's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to take a long time. But my goodness, it's got to be done. Someone has got to do it.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that if not you, then who, right? It's also, I think you so you cannot expect someone just, working for a day wage at McDonald's to try to do something like that. And I think that privilege, and which kind of leads me. So before I actually go to the next part, which is good bankers, good citizens, and the role of the bank in society, because it's kind of, what you just said leads towards that. If we can just digress for a second around Seagrass, because I've seen some of your LinkedIn posts and I also looked up some and tried to learn a bit, but I think you have really spent a lot of time thinking and trying to understand this problem, the causes, and what's going on. So how would you actually try to get, how would you reverse this degradation? And what's the role of seagrass? What are the other factors that matter? And what are these things that are obvious to you now, but that someone who's never really thought about this probably has no clue about?
This all began when Mark Carney was the governor of the Bank of England, and he was, I thought, overly passionate on environmental popular causes, shall I say. And I became seriously concerned he was going to tell us to go and plant trees. And I'm a bit skeptical of the value of banks planting trees. I discovered that if you want to sequester carbon dioxide, you can do it 25 to 30 times more efficiently underwater with seagrass than you can on land with trees. So I got curious about seagrass and started working on a small patch and with the Cornwall Wildlife Trust. And then they got a much bigger patch, and I increased my donations to them to deal with this bigger patch of seagrass. And in it, they had stuff called merle. Merle looks astonishingly like coral, but isn't coral. And it is very, very rare. It's found only in Cornwall and the Hebrides. And you can trash coral and you can regrow it, but it will take you 6,000 years to regrow it. It's a slow-growing plant, so you don't really want it trashed. Which comes to the answer to your question. What are the problems? Degradation problems. The first one is bottom trawling. So David Attenborough wrote this and did this film Ocean last year, I think, showing just what harm bottom.
And how little value comes from it, right? I mean, it's not really very effective either, right? Like, it's just absurd. Yeah. I don't know why we do this.
It's widely understood to be a problem, and governments are particularly going around creating these marine protected areas, but they don't police them. So it does the square root of nothing in terms of benefit. But that's one big problem area. And the other big problem area is water quality. So if we have water companies pumping out really nasty effluent, or if you have farmers with runoff, nitrogen runoff, that will destroy the marine environment. So these things have to be tackled. We know how to tackle them in areas. It's been successfully done in places, but we're now talking about doing it on a large scale. And the benefits will be large scale if we achieve them.
Yeah, I think this is such an interesting topic, and perhaps in the future we can get some of the marine biology experts you work with to do a deep sort of slightly more technical session to understand what's going on, what are the challenges and learnings, because I think this is a thing that people care about but haven't really had the time to deeply engage with and understand what's going on.
And we talked earlier about the benefits of small is beautiful and keep it simple. This area is neither small nor simple. To get nature restoration to be done big, and it's going to be complicated.
Yeah. But that's why I think it makes sense to really dig deeper and try to understand it well before doing something naive. So we're now, we're already now in this theme of good bankers, good citizens, the bank and society. I think this has been a big part of the legacy of the bank from what I understand. And, you say to be good bankers and good citizens, there are, there are very few people that try to explicitly do both. And I'd love to have you speak about this part of your life, of the bank's life, the business's life, the family's legacy, because I think it's something that you care about deeply. And I'd be happy to understand the learnings, the mechanisms, the evolution of this.
We spoke earlier about earning trust and gaining reputation, and the risk of losing trust and losing reputation. In our experience of the last 300 years, we have done a lot of good works. A lot of schools, hospitals, churches, a hospice, and many, many other good works, all of which can only have been paid for by good people. Any place the money could come from. And we're talking a lot of money. And it's important per se for society, but it's been really important for us because society likes us for having done that. So you get what you might call a feedback loop, a virtuous circle.
Positive feedback loop, right? That's reinforcing.
We look after our community and our community looks after us. And it's a very nice synergy there. And that was done, I don't know how consciously or unconsciously the partners then did it because I wasn't there, but we consciously give about 10% of our profits each year to our charitable trust, and then we deploy them in various ways. But we're trying to use the bank's profits to have good social impacts. And I think we are. We publish an impact report. You can download it from our website.
And to contrast this with bad bankers. I think if we just look back at 2008, right? I think you write, and I quote you there, the authorities who set the scene within which bankers legitimately maximize their short-term gains. So what you say is that we see the headlines, we see a bunch of rogue traders, we see a bunch of people sometimes being prosecuted, sometimes going to jail, not that often, not as much as perhaps should have been done. But that's again a focus on the individual, on the individual's ethics, etc. But there is also a systemic problem here. And I think that's what you're sort of alluding to. But would you like to speak about what's going on there? And is it all about just the fact that there is limited liability, that people are not liable for what they do in a more extreme sense?
Unlimited liability helps us want to behave well to our community, definitely. If you go back to 2008, the great financial crash in the UK kicked off with a bank called Northern Rock, which was doing bad banking at the end of the day. It didn't have enough liquidity to support itself. One of the tragedies of that is that they were actually giving quite a lot of money to local communities, and that all stopped. So in this case, the bad banking not only costs whoever rescued it, I forget if it was the government now or some other bank, but somebody had to rescue it, and the communities, local community groups all suffer the double bad impact. So you can aim for good impacts and get maybe double good impacts, or you can get doubly bad impacts if it goes wrong.
And I think this idea of being a good bank, a good banker, and it's sort of also based on, and being a good citizen is based on being a good person. And this sort of brings us to this idea, which is very personal, and I'm glad that we're speaking about it, which is the idea of faith, of family, and in a more broader sense, the inner life. Because I think, in a very deep sense, that's what really makes life worth living and gives it meaning. So in your book, you're unusually honest about the inner life behind the bank, and I think listeners would really value that honesty, and that's why I recommend everyone read the book and sort of reflect on it. There's just so much there. And you write that you came to faith slowly and skeptically, which I would argue is probably a very good way to come to faith, perhaps. I mean, that's the way I went. I sort of also approached the inner life is, with a lot of slow skepticism and conviction building. And you kind of read and argued your way in rather than via, some kind of family or parental, I guess, setup. And what was that experience like? How do you, how did you convince yourself of faith? How did you argue and rationalize yourself into faith, if put it that way?
So there was no single moment. Sometimes you get asked, what was the moment? I haven't got an answer to that. What I find quite curious is how many people go through all the choices they have to make every day without a guideline, a guide star. I don't know how they do it. I find it extremely useful to know, what good looks like. And then many of our listeners will not be familiar with the Old Testament, but there are books of kings and judges and other books where the message comes through over and over again that societies which went ex-God all came to a bad end, every one of them. And societies which listened to God's word did very much better. And I feel that we, particularly in Europe, actually, have gone ex-God, and it's not a happy economy or society for it. But that's probably straying into politics.
Yeah. No, and I think religion has had its dark sides around the world and across history. But I think we've, as you say, we've thrown the baby with the bathwater. I think just because something, a lot of things have, like almost everything one could argue has a dark side to it, and that's not a reason not to engage with it or do it. And I think the point is to look for the bright side. You write something, I think, that I found that I kind of also resonate with. You said an hour in church was ideal for a mental reset. So you just sometimes go and sit for an hour and it just come out and, a new person. And I've had this with kind of sitting quietly, meditating, sort of looking inward. And interestingly, even though I'm not, and I don't sort of practice a formal religion, but like I've had these magical moments at places of worship where you just feel something special and different, and just feel like you're a different person. I've had it at a small village church here in southern Bavaria, or perhaps just across the border in Austria, and there was no one. It was raining outside, and then I just sat for a while, with my eyes closed, and just calm. And then at some point I got up, walked to the altar, and Ave Maria started booming, and it was
Lovely.
just and there was really no
Yeah.
one, and it was just such a special moment that you just feel it. I had a similar one at a giant temple in Rajasthan in India. So just sitting and at the edge, looking at the valley and the hill, the green valley, and like the semi-arid valley and the hill, and you just close your eyes, the wind is blowing, and you look at these 100-year-old marble sculptures, and you just feel something. And I think you can really go anywhere and just and reset yourself. And as you said, I mean, it's I don't as you said, it's surprising why more people don't do it.
And yeah, I had a period of 9 years of my life. I was on the finance committee at Westminster Abbey. Unbelievably beautiful building. So many people don't even go and see the beautiful building they've got on their doorstep. Very peculiar.
Yeah. Now to sort of get to some of the funny stories, right? So just to have a bit of fun, right? So there is a story where you had an Aston Martin overdraft. Do you want to share what happened there?
So on that occasion, a customer rang up on a Friday, asked for an overdraft. I don't know what an Aston Martin cost, but maybe £80,000, £100,000. And I said yes, which was a breach of our normal lending processes. And he bought the car and drove it down to Cornwall. I knew he wanted to buy the car that day to get himself to Cornwall. And one of my cousins said, you should not have done that. It's not in accordance with our lending programs. And I argued, well, what could possibly go wrong? The worst thing that could happen is I get a new car. And actually, the best thing happened. He repaid us, and I got stuck with my old car.
Then there is the motorcycle bank guarantee. I think you get a call on Sunday. There's a customer almost dying. You need to arrange for an air or finance an air ambulance and pay hospital bills in a different country, in a different region. Well, it sounds like a super crazy, scary, worrying kind of setting. So like, what happened there, and how did that customer, being your customer, make this thing happen on a Sunday?
So that was an unfunny story. My phone rang at 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning in December, so it was dark, and it was my customer's wife explained to me that there was an air ambulance in the air, and they needed to pick up her husband, and if they didn't, he'd die. And what was I going to do? And the problem was the hospital wasn't going to release their patient until they got paid. And so what I did do was I motorcycled into the bank. It doesn't take long on a Sunday morning. Fired up my computer and wrote off the top of my head a bank guarantee. And then I went home and it worked. They released the customer. The customer flew back. Customer's still a customer. This is 30 years later. He's been a paraplegic ever since. He's in a wheelchair. And the moral of the story, I think, is that with private ownership, you can do things no public banker could possibly do. If I was working at a clearing bank, I wouldn't get through the door on a Sunday morning. And if I got through a door on a Sunday morning, I wouldn't get into the computer system. But and then would I want to? Would I want to extend sort of unquantified credit to some guy? Well, I happen to know this guy was good for it. I wasn't at all worried about the credit decision. I knew my partners wouldn't criticize me for the credit decision, but could he do that in a big bang? It's not. And so that guy, if he'd been banking at the wrong bank, would be dead now.
Yeah. No, that's why it's such an important story. I mean, like, it's a tragic story as far as the customer is concerned, but I think it uniquely shows what you were able to do, and that a clearing bank might not. And this one's actually funny. I think there's a lady who hadn't been in the red since the 1960s because you stopped printing in color. Was it to cut costs, or how come you are now printing in color?
It's a complexity thing. So cost and complexity, as you know, go hand in hand. So computers and typewriters, you could put in a red ribbon and or a black ribbon, but it's a lot easier just to have a black ribbon. And what banks have done since the 1960s is when you're overdrawn, it's a deeper black and it says DR by it. But she hadn't clocked that. So she thought if it wasn't in red, it was good.
That's a funny one, yeah.
I was sort of asked to ring her up and ask her about her ever increasing overdraft. And she said, "What? Overdraft? I haven't been in the red since 1960. She was old, but she's a really smart lady. I once played bridge with her and she bid and made a grand slam in the first hand.
Wow. Okay.
But given how old she was, I couldn't see the point of upsetting the apple cart. I just left her in peace.
Yeah. No, I mean, that makes sense. What's the point? There's also a nice, there's a really nice story, which is where you backed a choir against your, typical rule of never sponsoring something. And what happened there?
So across the road from where we are on Fleet Street, there is a church, historically quite an important church. And the priest in charge there allowed a young, quite fun choir to rehearse in his church because they needed somewhere to rehearse. And in return, he asked them to sing at various important services he had. He didn't have many, it was a choir church. One of them was our carol service. So they would sing at our carol service in church and come back to the party afterwards and singing and ran the piano there. It was lovely. So that went on for a bit. And then one day they said, we need some sponsorship to go and sing in a competition. And that was all I knew. And I said, well, I'll ask my friends in sponsorship or advertising or marketing if they can help. And they all quite rude to me, actually, said, it's not how it works. And decided that I would see if my partners would find some money to sponsor them, which we did. And they went off and sang their little hearts out. And they came back the BBC Choir of the Year, which is a very highly esteemed prize. So for a very small sum of money, we collected a rather good sponsorship by mistake. A lot of good things happen by mistake.
Yeah, and I think we should trust ourselves to make more of these nice mistakes. I guess that's
a really good point. So I talk about errors of commission and errors of omission, and if I was to have my time again, I might trust myself to do more wild things.
Yeah, and there's one really funny one, which is I think on your first day when you were at the bank, someone asks you, "Are you one of them oars?" What's that?
So the Cockneys drop their H's. Instead of saying "whore," they say "oar." And an oar is also what you row your rowing boat with. So when she said, "Are you one of them oars?" I wondered if I was a plank.
And on the anecdote stuff, there is one last thing which I don't know, really I think will stay with me forever. There's a guy who taught you how to kick down doors. You kind of gave money and supported him for a bit. And I think he had a massive scaling and compounding effect. And he, I think, even made the case to you how he was actively preventing crimes from happening every week with very little money. So I think it really shows how you can get leverage in philanthropy. It's not about who has more money. It's about where that money goes. It's that, again, signal placement at the feedback loop or at the constraint.
So this was an odd story. It came through my church. My priest asked me to read a business plan, and it was Christmas. I couldn't tell him to get stuffed, so I said, "All right, send the business plan through." And it arrived quite a lot later, and it was badly presented, and it was illiterate, and it was beguilingly good. And I said to the priest, "Okay, send this guy around. I'll meet him." And he came in, and he was Nigerian, and he was just out of prison, and he'd been in prison for armed robbery. So now I'm in a small room with an armed robber, and we got on really well, actually. I liked him a lot, and I believed him when he said he didn't do the robbery because he was living with his mother, and his mother was the person who got robbed. So I thought he might be telling the truth on this occasion. And when you're straight out of prison, you basically haven't got a hope. They give you no hope at all, and so you're most likely to reoffend and go back into prison, which is actually most of the time what does happen. And I've got some expertise in this. And this guy did encourage me to take a bit of a leap, and his business plan was to gather up the loved ones around the suburbs and put them in a bus and take them to see prisoners, their loved prisoners. And why it was a good business plan is that doing it by public transport was difficult, if not impossible. They put prisoners in places which are difficult to escape from. And they're also difficult to get to. And so there was a really clear economic case for doing it this way. The prison governors loved it because they knew who was going to visit and when, and it could be organized, and he could make a living doing it. So I lent him some money to do that, and off he went. And next thing I knew, I lent him more money to buy a bus. And then we had this extraordinary sort of relationship where I learned more and more about him, I suppose. One day he was carting around some stuff for me, and there was a portrait. And he said, "Oh, I did portrait painting." And I said, "When did you do portrait painting?" And he said, "Well, after tea in prison, there wasn't much to do, so I'd paint people's portraits and make some money." And another day he said, "I've got going now." I said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I'm going to play football." You might not know I'm playing semi-professional football. I had no idea. And then it was one of these conversations when you said, I save 70 crimes a week. And I said, how do you do that? And you said, well, I get 70 kids on a Saturday playing football who would otherwise be committing crime.
Yeah, that's true. I think that's just so true. So as we wrap up, I think this idea of stewardship and what is enough is something I want to speak to you. It's about the psychology of money, the emotional part of money, what money does to people, right? Because we've spoken about business, about compounding, about the quantitative and the let's say the business and economic financial aspects of money and wealth. I want to speak about the emotions now and the sort of the intimacy that you have with money, right, in terms of fear of family conflict, the corrosion of entitlement that can happen, and then the relief that comes from giving sometimes. Because I quote you and you say, we help our customers get poorer as well as richer by encouraging them to give. And so I guess you're helping your customers get richer financially, but you also encourage them to get poorer by giving. And do you want, so everyone has some kind of fraught relationship with money, right? And it's rare to hear a banker talk about the emotional aspects of money. So beneath all the business and the ideas around how you made the business work, etc., your book also keeps coming back to this idea and this idea of modern capitalism and how modern capitalism does not use two words enough, and those words I think are stewardship and enough. And yeah, I'd love to hear what you make of this.
So in the book, I wrote chapters on marketing, information technology, investment management, strategy, partnership. I wrote all these chapters about running a bank, but by far and away the longest chapter turned out to be on philanthropy. I had no idea that was going to happen. And I suppose I can make a couple of points about money. One is that money doesn't buy you happiness. I touched on this earlier. If you want to be happy, you need to have a purpose. And money can help you then do your purpose, but you can be happy with or without money. And the other kind of allied point is Jesus says that the root of all evil is the love of money. The love of money is the root of all. There's nothing wrong with money per se. It's if you fall in love with it that evil things can happen. And so I would encourage people to be slightly emotionally detached from money. And it's great to have. It's fantastic. But don't fall in love with it. And do give, because you can get a lot of happiness from making it.
And I think we spoke about a few examples where just a little bit of money had such a massive asymmetric impact. And I guess that's why you probably also called your book Impact Banker. So
there were multiple reasons for that title. So one was the impact investment I've been doing. One was I'm not a retail banker. I didn't do the mass public. I'm not a private banker. I didn't do investments. I'm not an investment banker. What sort of banker am I? And I'm one trying to have fun getting decent impacts. But the deeper point is that one day I shall die and everybody else will die and meet our maker or St. Peter of the pearly gates. And you may get faced with the question, in the life we gave you, the talents we gave you, did you use them to have the greatest impact on the largest number of people? Good impact. If yes, turn left to business class, and if no, turn right to economy class. So I think you want to have a good answer ready should you get asked that question.
Yeah, I think, and I think that's what also resonated a lot. I mean, I completely independently, I mean, we hadn't spoken at all, but like when I was trying to think about the first title for my book, I also didn't know, man. I knew it had something to do with data. I'd worked 10 years in the field. And then I said, yeah, everyone's speaking about big, and there's a whole bunch of adjectives being used and nouns, and I'm like, it's not really when I think the word impact, it was really what came out. And so I think this is also something we really aligned on in terms of values. You spoke about dying and you spoke about the end. And I would love to end this on that note, on this idea of legacy and succession. So I think it'd be a great way to close this conversation. You've just appointed the first 12th generation partner, if I'm right. And you wear your grandfather's watch every day. You just showed it when we spoke about your grandfather. And in some ways, I think you measure your own tenure at the bank as a small fraction in the history of the bank and the future of the bank. What are your thoughts on legacy and succession?
It's about stewardship. And a good steward will try to do his best and he'll hope to leave behind him to the next generation something better than he inherited. And I'm content that I have fulfilled that duty.
And if someone from the 12th generation or hopefully from the 20th generation, if this video survives, has listened to this, what would be your message to them?
I would hope that they would continue to perpetuate a profitable family business. I would hope that they would try to do good business and good for society. It doesn't have to be banking. I can see it might change sometime. I would hope that they would encourage their staff with the same values as today's staff. Number one is treat your neighbor as you wish to be treated. So treat others as you wish to be treated.
And I think on that note, I'll just quote you one last time. You say, I'm optimistic that consumers can choose to spend their money wisely. Businesses can choose to produce sustainably. Managements can act ethically. Thank you so much, Alexander. It was really a pleasure. We planned to speak for 2 hours. I think we've spoken for almost 3 hours. Thank you for this conversation.
Well, thank you. And good luck with your book.
Thank you.